the reason for this delegation's visit is a disaster that has occurred in 2014 when the Mount Polley tailings dam failed. That is it was a huge tragedy, and so I would just like if we could take a moment to reflect on the fact that this wonderful opportunity for us is coming at a very high cost.
The Mount Polley mine disaster on August 4th, 2014 sent shockwaves across the country and I would say around the world. It was the largest environmental mining disaster in Canadian history, and almost 4 years later we still haven't seen justice for the people who were harmed by the disaster. There have been no fines, no penalties, and no criminal charges laid for a mining disaster that released 24 million cubic meters of toxic mine waste and effluent into our pristine waterways. The impact of this breach has created significant harms for Indigenous peoples living in Secwepemc territory and downstream, and for other people who rely on Quesnel Lake and its waterways for food, for drinking water, for cultural and spiritual practices. The cleanup effort has been largely subsidized by the Canadian public, by British Columbia taxpayers, 30 cents on every dollar spent on cleanup by the company we've subsidized. So by telling us that the polluter pays, not to worry, everything will be taken care of, there will be no water discharges, don't worry, we got your back, we're experts, we know what we're doing. That hasn't been our story, and we don't want that to be your story.
When I went outside, you could hear it. It was like a roar from Niagara Falls in the background, and it did that for 3 days while it poured all that material down into the lake. They promised never to discharge water into the environment, and yet after the breach, when they dumped 25 million cubic meters in, they actually got a permit to continue discharging water. We had many concerns and put forward proposals that would protect the lake with water quality. Those were all turned down. 3 days after the event happened, of course, everybody's still trying to get their heads wrapped around it. The Premier of the province flies in, choppers, all the news agencies, lots of interviews and stuff, and she promises us that she's going to ensure that the lake is returned back to the pristine state that it was before the accident, and that she's had our backs and she would support us all the way. Well, that turned out basically to be a total lie, because none of that happened.
The human rights involved in this potential project, the information that's so far come to light, we're talking about the right to health. The state of Minnesota has not seen fit to complete a health impact statement on the human beings who live, who work in the mine, who live near the mine, who live downstream from this proposed mine. The long-term environmental damage, there's questions about whether this mine can be a safe mine in a climate like Minnesota's. The Indigenous rights violations, the impact that this could have on wild rice, on the traditional life of Indigenous people who live in the area. What's happening with the Fond du Lac tribe? How much have they been consulted? What's going to happen with the already dangerous levels of mercury in the environment? The unfortunate reality. So we've heard about the horrors of the PolyMet, of the Mount Polley disaster, and it's not alone. The UN Environmental Program documented 7 major disasters in the last 10 years. And the question for Minnesota is, does Minnesota want to be next?
Minnesotans like to think we're better than average. Unfortunately, we're also vulnerable to the very same problems that have occurred worldwide. Here in Minnesota, we've had multiple near-miss accidents with tailings basins in just the last few years. We can ill afford that risk with copper-nickel tailings that are far more toxic, that contain arsenic and mercury and lead and sulfates and a whole host of other things we don't want in our waterways. And so we are incredibly thankful for the folks from Amnesty, from the people from British Columbia who've come today to testify and tell the people who live downstream what is at stake if we get this decision wrong.
As a citizen of British Columbia who was told to trust the regulatory process, to trust the companies, to have our best interests and the interests of the public good at heart, that the rights of Indigenous peoples would be protected, and that after the disaster, things would return back to the way they were. That didn't happen, and that's had a significant impact on residents of British Columbia. We were told by our own mining experts that reviewed the Mount Polley mine disaster with this kind of technology. It's not a question of if a tailings dam will fail, it's a question of when. And so the question for you is, do you feel that you have the backing to be able to deal with a disaster if it happens? And in the almost 4 years since the disaster, there has been no accountability, despite what we were told from the very beginning. And we really do not want to see that happen here in this beautiful part of the world.
I was woken up with a phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning that there had been a breach of the dam. I went outside and you could hear it roaring in the background. It was like being at Niagara Falls. And that flow lasted for 3 to 4 days. And it took them a week to actually stop the flow altogether.
I work for Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and we've been studying this in depth for the last decade. And I want to stress that these problems that the folks from British Columbia are mentioning are not problems that Minnesota is immune to. In fact, Minnesota has experienced a number of near-miss tailings disasters in just the last 4 or 5 years. Many of these have never been reported in the media. Many of them are unknown to you, perhaps. In February of 2012, the Hibbing Taconite mine, their tailings dam developed a 1,000-foot crack overnight. This is in the middle of winter, basically the same time we're in right now. They had to build an emergency buttress to prevent this from spilling open. It was not widely reported. The only reason it became known to the public was because they had to apply for a permit to fill the wetlands necessary to build the buttress. In 2013 and 2014, the ArcelorMittal Minorca mine experienced 3 separate tailings releases from its tailings basin. A pipeline failure and the failure of the dam released tailings over about a 20-acre area of wetlands covering it several feet deep. Now, that's not a big disaster, but it demonstrates that we have a series of really vulnerable earthworks. And PolyMet would build a 252-foot high earthen dam in an upstream design, which is considered the least stable, on top of an existing tailings facility from a taconite mine. And the copper nickel tailings that they would produce would be far more toxic and far more reactive than any of the waste from the taconite mines that Minnesotans are familiar with. I know that you may think to yourself, we're the city council, what do you want from me? But as folks who live downstream, you should know that these disasters are not things of the past. They're not things that only happen in countries far away. They can happen right here. And that's why it's so critical that everyone be involved in this process. And I thank you for your time today.
We in Duluth don't have the luxury of distance. There was a mine disaster in Brazil in 2015. The waste traveled 400 miles before reaching the ocean, and we're about 175 miles away from the mine site. We need to be listening to experts who are warning us that this tailings basin design is risky and unsafe. One expert specifically points out that 2 of the factors that led to the disaster in Mount Polley are also incorporated in the dam design for PolyMet. This decision will broadcast our priorities and is irreversible.
I think things that people should be concerned about are and ask questions about in Minnesota. Like Glencore has walked away from agreements that it's made. So it negotiates a contract and then walks away, and then the workers are left holding the bag. And when a company has that kind of record, The question is, are they going to follow, any laws, and also does the state of Minnesota really want to be in that position of, chasing down a multinational corporation and getting them to follow up on its agreements, or should it be in business, or should it be bringing companies into the state that do respect laws? I think Minnesota should learn a number of lessons on human rights from the Mount Polley disaster. One is it really matters what the record of the multinational corporations are that are coming in. And what's the record on the range of human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, cleanup, like what's going on in terms of what are the promises made, and whether the companies, can fulfill the deals that they've made.
I think one of the things to keep in mind, at least in British Columbia, is that most of our big mines are away from urban centers. So in a lot of cases, it's out of sight, out of mind, especially for people in urban centers like the Lower Mainland of Vancouver or Victoria, where decisions are made in our legislature. And so people often just take for granted that the public good will be taken care of, that we've got world-class laws and policies. We've got the best experts. We, send our experts around the world to drum up interest in Canadian mining. And so the expectation has been that we would just be taken care of, that if we have a law in the books that says the polluter pays, the polluter will pay. And what the Mount Polley disaster revealed to us is none of that was correct or adequate. So I've been hearing some of the same ideas discussed here. Well, we've got world-class laws, our environmental legislation is very strong, etc. So that worries me, that people might take it for granted that, their environment will be taken care of, or their human rights will be taken care of by the existing legislation, and that it'll be applied evenly and consistently. But the key recommendation that the BC's Auditor General made in 2016 was to separate the compliance enforcement aspects of the Ministry of Energy and Mines from mining promotion, saying that there's too great a risk of corporate capture. The two functions are contradictory.
I would just comment that the year Mount Polley blew out, Pat and I went to a mining conference in Reno, Nevada. And of course, that's all the miners were talking about, is the public relations to handle this catastrophe. And the one comment I remember from a mining promoter is that people have short memories. And so I'd like to thank our friend from Canada for coming down here to keep the memories of Mount Polley alive. Thank you.
So I run an organization called the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. We're a 43-year-old environmental organization. We have lawyers, lobbyists, policy experts, technical experts, and we can go to court, we can lobby, and we can work with agencies, and that's kind of our role within the environmental movement. We're sort of the expertise. I'm aware, as I stand up here, that the other groups that are co-sponsors of this organization, or this event, I should say, there's a lot of groups who have enormous expertise, knowledge, background, and energy invested in this issue, and so I'm really actually quite honored to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of those groups and to all of you tonight, because I know there's a lot of knowledge in this room already. So, an area where we've seen no improvement at all is the actual use and structure of the tailings dam. That's our topic here for tonight. That has not changed since 2005. This was a structure that was built in the 1960s, before the Clean Water Act, before environmental review, and there's really no reason why we should be simply piling on top of it. We know how to do this better now, and this is not the right way to go about it. We've, and many other groups that are here tonight, have been pressuring DNR for years to try to fix this problem, to figure out another way to deal with their tailings waste. DNR, to their credit, did hire some external experts who then reviewed their proposal, PolyMet's proposal. Less to DNR's credit, DNR has not taken their advice. We have obtained through Data Practices Act request, which is like the state version of FOIA, some documents in which the engineers that DNR hired say things like, this structure would be not permittable as a permanent structure in other jurisdictions, that it is the risk of failure is almost certain over time, and that long-term erosion will lead to, and I quote, catastrophic dam failure over time. This is the information they're getting from their own people. They're not listening. A couple other things that I heard from Doug and Tara that I think are relevant here. Doug raised the concern about independence of information. This is the concern that we have here in Minnesota. Our own legislature just passed a law last session that said that people who are proposing a project can write their own environmental impact statement. That's a problem, because those companies, of course, have a very strong incentive to minimize environmental risk in order to achieve lower standards at permitting. So that's unacceptable. We also have the same problem of conflict of interest. Our own DNR is tasked with regulating mining, and they're also tasked with promoting mineral extraction across the state. It's the same agency. We've pushed for years to try to separate that, but it has not happened. There's a clear conflict of interest there. And of course, that we see the lack of resources. Over time, the legislature has not been allocating the funds necessary to our agencies in order to ensure that there's actual enforcement going on at these sites. And that's a real problem as well. What I think, we've learned tonight, it's the same thing that we learned from the report that came out after the Mount Polley disaster happened from a panel of independent experts. And they said that the only tolerable risk is zero risk. That is the recommendation. And the only way to get to that point is to take water out of the equation. That means you have to remove the water from the tailing storage. This wet storage impoundment, that's a technology of the past, and we need to move beyond that. And yet we see that PolyMet and our own regulators refuse to acknowledge that. My position, the position of our organization, and I'm sure many of the other groups here tonight, is that Minnesota has a moral obligation to future generations to permit only a facility with the highest possible standards. And in the wake of Mount Polley, there are other jurisdictions and other places that are moving ahead. We do see mines that are built with different kinds of tailing strategies that minimize or eliminate this risk. Minnesota is falling behind. We have fallen behind on this, and we are not permitting a safe mine here. This is a mine that is upstream from Duluth, and the city of Duluth has not consented to this risk. All of you tonight, I'm guessing, came out to, or many of you came out to the PolyMet public hearings that were here last week. And all of you, thank you so much. You have to stand up and speak out. We'll be fighting for you in St. Paul. We're on your side with lawyers, we'll be in court, we'll be in hearings, but your participation is critical. Sign the petition, send in the comments, and speak out, because Duluth, your voice matters. Thank you.